Hello, romance students, and welcome to week 12. We have just 3 more stories left to us, and so this is our last intro video to try and talk about all 3 of them as quickly as possible, just to make sure you're oriented and ready to go with all 3 of these stories. So what we have here are 3 stories that have, on the surface, very little in common, except for the fact that they are all written by an anonymous author. There's sort of a lovely idea suggested by Virginia Woolf, saying that maybe every anonymous story out there was written by a woman. Obviously, I don't think that's true, but it's kind of nice to contemplate, especially when you think about the tone of these 3 stories. So I've chosen for the image to represent our author this week um, an image of a female scribe and teaching some students in front of her. Her name is Prudence. And one of the things that I want to make sure we all understand, though, is that these stories are not written by the same person. They have been written across the course of the 14th century, and they were all written in English, but they're from different parts of the country, different time periods. And what they have in common is not their author, but some of their themes and their ideas. So all 3 of these stories, they are Sir Orfeo, Emaré, and Sir Gowther. Those are the 3 stories. Sir Gowther is how you would say it in Middle English, but Emaré, Orfeo, and Gowther. These are all based on popular folklore motifs, ideas, themes that have been circulating around. So they feel familiar. They feel like fairy tales a little bit. We'll recognize a lot of the images, and even if we've never read these stories before, something about them will hit us kind of deeply in our hearts, I think. These 3 stories take the key aspects of romance that we've been looking at all semester. Somebody's in peril, somebody goes on a quest, they usually have to go through a period of isolation, and of course, love. So these elements of romance that we've been used to, but they take those elements in really different directions and explore some radically different ideas by doing so. The love story in all of them actually ends up being kind of like a side quest, if you will. It's not the main focus of the story. And I think you will enjoy seeing the ways that these stories open up new possibilities for the genre at sort of the end of what we think of as the medieval period in Europe. So let's look at these 3 stories very briefly, each one. The first of them, as I said, is Sir Orfeo. It's from the early 14th century. It might even be the very end of the 13th century, but it's probably the early 14th century. It tells the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, which is a Greek myth, going back to at least the 6th century BCE. And that Orpheus myth is really popular with medieval European Christians. It has a tragic ending. If you don't know the story, I did put a link to it up on Blackboard so that you could read it. It's very short. And it's a really important metaphor for like the way that you need to think about sin and temptation and human desire, and like that you shouldn't try to control the things that should really be left to God, that should really be taken on faith. And so if you're familiar with the story, that will make sense to you. If you're not familiar with the story, go and read it, and then it will make sense to you. And if it doesn't, well, then ask about it in class on Thursday. But it's really a nice retelling of it. But it isn't just the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. It's this kind of great mashup of that Greek myth and Celtic folklore, and putting in a nice little dose of Christian values and Christian worldview on top of that. And this is like a thing that medieval people love. They really like this idea of anachronisms and various times and places and different kinds of stories all mushed together. And we will talk about that a lot this week. So I'm not going to spend too much time on it right now, but it's one of those things that's incredibly popular with medieval readers. And this story just hits it all. It's like this, if I had to say like a perfect example of what medieval readers loved, this is it. Like this story, this would be the thing that I would choose to introduce that idea every single time. Okay, so that's Sir Orfeo. By the way, I was just going to say that all 3 of these images that I have to represent these 3 stories are obviously they're modern art that is inspired by these stories. That just kind of gives us a hint of the way that the stories and the ideas that they present are still with us today. All right, Emaré. Emaré is a story that many of you might find frustrating, but I'm going to ask you to kind of push through it a little bit. It is a story that is, you may not really recognize it at first as a romance, but trust me, it's gonna make a lot of sense after we talk about it a bit. So this story is from the late 14th century, and it's part of a group of tales that are called the Constance Saga, both because the main character exhibits constancy, the virtue of constancy, but also because the woman's name, who is our protagonist, is often Constance. And there's a version of this in the Canterbury Tales. We're not reading that one. We're reading a different one. But in that version, her name is Constance. And it's what happens to her is, man, it just sucks. Like poor Constance, or in this case, Emaré, really has a tough go of it. But it ends up being a really interesting story and a really interesting quest. And I think you will enjoy seeing the ways that the romance themes work through Emaré's story. So as I said, we have both in this story a female protagonist and a female antagonist. And so what that ends up doing is it takes these ideas of romance, and usually we have the protagonist there as a knight, right? Who has to go out and bash people's skulls in and learn things and fight for those who need fighting for, and protecting those who need protecting. But this models a really different kind of strength because the protagonist is a woman. And so MRA gives us, instead of all of those knightly versions of chivalry, we have virtues instead of patience and perseverance and faith and forgiveness. And this may remind some of you of Le Fresne that we looked at the early in the semester from Marie de France. But it's a really interesting, beautiful story. And even though MRA takes a lot of shit, she ends up teaching us some really great lessons. And it's just, anyway, it's a story that I look forward to talking about. That's all I'm going to say about it for now. And then finally, our last story is Sir Gowther, Sir Gowther, if you're saying it in Middle English, but we'll say Gowther is fine with me. This image hopefully will suggest something kind of sinister to you, and as it should. So this story is from right at the turn of the 15th century. It was written right around 1400, so the very, very end of the 14th century or the very beginning of the 15th century. This story uses a lot of different folklore motifs. Number one of which is this idea that a barren couple wants to have a child. And the story there is, be careful what you wish for. What happens in this story and in several others, including the origin story of the wizard Merlin, is that Sir Gowther, his mother, who wishes very desperately to have a child, is impregnated by the devil. Yeah, and that's not so great. So it's part of this group of stories that feature angelic or demonic children, and the angelic children are obviously like super virtuous right from the get-go, wise beyond their years. The demonic children are just a terror right from the get-go. You will see that with Gowther. He does a lot of really bad things, and then has to make up for it. So after all the terrible things that Sir Gowther does as a child and as a young man, he goes on a journey of penance. He works for his redemption, and his quest is all about trying to make up for the bad things that he did early in his life. This is a really, I mean, yeah, there's something for everyone here. I feel like this would make a great action movie in so many ways because, you know, it's that quest to set your life right. But it's also in a medieval system of thinking about such things. It is modeling the sacrament of penance. Which, you know, even if you're not Catholic, you've probably heard of this. It's like when people go to confession, right? But it's not just as simple as like you go and you sit in a box and you tell a priest what you did and you get forgiven. It isn't quite like that. And we will talk a little bit more about the sacrament of penance when we talk about Sir Gowther. But it's sort of, his journey mirrors all of the steps that you're supposed to go through from when you have sinned to when you get forgiven, both by God and by your community. So it's a really interesting story. I keep saying that, but it's one of those things that makes you wonder, is it actually better to do bad things, recognize that you've done them, and then earn your way back, or to just be kind of like an okay person the whole time, like you never do anything bad, but that means that you never actually do anything really great either. So it's kind of a nice message of hope that even when you kind of fuck up, that you're able to earn your way back and get forgiven and become part of your community once again. So that's what I got about these three stories. I look forward to talking about them with all of y'all, and stay with it. We are in the home stretch. We've got just a couple more weeks left. We can do this. We will do this. And yeah, I look forward to it. I saved these stories for the end of the semester because they're all a little on the shorter side. They're all kind of like punchy and fun and interesting. And Yeah, this and you don't get tired of anything because every week is totally different. So anyway, that's what I got. Thanks so much. Take care, and I will see you on Thursday. Bye.